Hey everybody, today I'll be showing you how to MIDI sync your Eventide H9 and dot9 pedals. In this first example, I'll be syncing the micro pitch delay and ultra tap delay to the H9. The reason for doing this is so that all of the time-based effects stay in sync with each other. To make this happen, we need to send the H9's MIDI clock to the other pedals. Once we get it all set up, we'll be able to tap in a tempo on H9 and have that tempo be reflected on micro pitch and ultra tap. Once the pedals are receiving the same tempo, we can then choose different delay subdivisions for each pedal. First, let's open up the H9 control app and go to pedal settings. Then under MIDI settings, we want to make sure MIDI output clock is turned on. The MIDI output mode can be either transmit, meaning H9 will output its MIDI data, or through plus MIDI clock, meaning H9 will pass on incoming MIDI data, but also output its own clock. Now let's set the expression input on the dot9s to accept MIDI. To do this, enter System Setup by holding the active foot switch and the secondary button while applying power. Once the top two LEDs are flashing, you're in System Setup mode. Press the secondary button again to scroll through the expression pedal jack settings. The fourth one down is for using a MIDI box, and that's what I'll be using today. To set the dot9s to receive MIDI clock, enter the System Setup mode and press the active switch until the 5 LEDs are illuminated. If you want to sync only one pedal with H9, you can use a cable like this, which is a 5-pin MIDI to tip active TRS. But to sync more than one pedal, you'll need a MIDI box like the Disaster Area MIDI Box 4. Not all pedals do MIDI the same way, and a box like this allows you to have control of each TRS output. For the Eventide pedals, we want to set these to tip active. I'm using a 5-pin MIDI cable to go out of the H9 and into the MIDI box. From there, I'm using 2 TRS cables, one going to the expression jack on the micro pitch and the other into the ultra tap. You'll see that when I tap in a tempo on H9, the tempo LEDs on the dot9s sync up perfectly. One important thing to note is that each pedal will respond to MIDI clock differently depending on which tap mode they are set to, either time or tempo. When set to tempo mode, the tap LEDs blink and we'll be able to access note subdivisions according to the BPM on many parameters, whereas time mode displays a solid LED and will sync delays to clock in milliseconds. Here's an example that starts with a tape delay setting on H9 and then adds in different delay times from micro pitch and ultra tap. On ultra tap, many parameters are synced to MIDI clock, one of those being pre-delay. Here I'm using an in-tempo pre-delay time to add in some space. Another way to sync Eventide pedals with MIDI is to send MIDI clock from a MIDI controller. Instead of sending from H9, we'll now send clock from the Morningstar MC8. The setup process for this is similar to sending clock from the H9. We go out of the MIDI controller, into the adapter box, and then into the pedals. We can then use MIDI clock tap tempo on the controller to sync the pedals. If we want to incorporate H9 into the setup, we need to make sure that Enable MIDI Input Clock is turned on. If your MIDI controller doesn't send its own MIDI clock, you can still sync your Eventide pedals by sending a MIDI control change message. In the manuals for micro pitch and ultra tap, we find that MIDI CC number 9 controls tap tempo. So now we can have our controller send that MIDI message to both pedals to have the tempo stay in sync. When using MIDI CC to control tap tempo on the dot9s, set MIDI clock receive to off. Do the same thing on the H9. Here's one more sound example. By turning the length knob on ultra tap, we hear different time divisions of the taps that stay in tempo with the other pedals.